New waves of U.S. Marines were hitting the beach on Iwo Jima. Sherman tanks, the workhorse of American armor, rolled off the landing craft. Among them, however, were 8 machines that, despite their identical appearance, concealed a horrifying secret. These 8 tanks alone would be responsible for about a third of all Japanese casualties, and they would achieve this in the most nightmarish way possible. These were flame tanks. Their crews would play a decisive role in the victory, but some of them would pay a terrible price for using this weapon. From the moment humanity learned to control fire, it has constantly sought new ways to use it against its own kind. And as a rule, these methods were each more horrific than the last. In ancient times, flaming arrows and boiling oil poured from fortress walls were common. Later, fire found new applications on the battlefield, sometimes in utterly insane forms, such as when burning animals were sent charging toward enemy lines to sow panic and chaos. However, the true flamethrower, the kind we are talking about, didn't appear until the First World War. The Germans were the first to bring it to the battlefield in one of many desperate attempts to break the stalemate of trench warfare. When a German flamethrower operator first spewed a jet of fire across no man's land, Allied soldiers were shocked less by its lethality and more by its terrifying sight and sound. Initially, it was more of a psychological weapon. Of course, its effect on the human body quickly cemented its gruesome reputation. At the same time, flamethrowers were extremely dangerous to their own operators. There are known cases of entire German squads being killed by their own weapon due to a sudden change in wind direction. Early attempts were made in World War I to mount this weapon on tanks, but they didn't succeed. After the war, most nations paid little attention to flamethrowers. That all changed when the Americans found themselves drawn into the war in the Pacific. And you're about to understand why. Before we get to the tanks, we need to set the stage by talking about the man-portable flamethrowers, so the whole picture makes sense. On the eve of the Second World War, the Allies had a few of these weapons, but they didn't generate much enthusiasm. There weren't even specialized flamethrower units. They were used on a case-by-case basis, and that was about it. But then reports began to come in that German assault groups were actively using flamethrowers. This sent American strategists back to the drawing board. They rushed the development of a new series of man-portable models, which were fielded long before the first flame tank rolled off a landing craft. The man-portable flamethrower was a strange weapon, the best and worst of its kind at the same time. On one hand, it could do what rifles and grenades couldn't, effectively clear an enemy position by, to put it mildly, burning the people inside. Grenades could also do the job, but once you understand what the fortifications on Iwo Jima looked like, it becomes clear why the flamethrower was often the only effective solution. The U.S. military developed the M1 flamethrower in a backpack configuration with a nozzle for the operator to aim at the target. It consisted of 2 tanks holding about 5 gallons of flammable mixture and a compressed nitrogen cylinder located between them, which propelled a stream at a range of 20 to 40 yards at best. That was its maximum effective range. When full, the pack weighed about 70 pounds and provided roughly 7 to 10 seconds of continuous fire. The fuel passed through the nozzle and in early models was ignited by an electrical spark from batteries. This method proved unreliable and was later replaced with a pyrotechnic ignition system, where a pair of white phosphorus cartridges would burn long enough to ignite the mixture. Operators fired a mixture of diesel, gasoline, and a napalm thickening agent, which created a sticky substance that burned at around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit and clung to everything it touched. Flamethrower operators also developed a tactic where they would first spray the target with the mixture without igniting it. This allowed the liquid to soak the fortification and seep deep inside. Then, a single ignited burst would set everything and everyone inside on fire. The effectiveness of flamethrowers in clearing pillboxes, compared to conventional weapons, was due to the fact that the flames didn't need to reach the soldiers directly. An explosion, or grenade fragments, can only kill someone in the immediate vicinity. Fortifications were specifically built to minimize the effect of grenades. They had a zigzag shape with grenade sumps and niches, so a soldier could kick a grenade out at the last second. When a flamethrower hit a pillbox, the effect was completely different. Besides the flames and extreme temperatures, it burned up most of the oxygen inside. Thus, even those not directly touched by the flames suffered from monstrous heat and asphyxiation. Perhaps we shouldn't delve too deeply into the physiological effects of flamethrower burns, as this video could easily be taken down. Studies were conducted on whether the flamethrower was too inhumane a way to kill. The results ranged from descriptions of it as the worst way to die to arguments that the senses are so overloaded that a person doesn't have time to feel pain. This painless theory is hard to believe, especially when you consider the screams that came from the caves. Perhaps we should stop there. Now you understand why the flamethrower became the one weapon that could truly smoke the enemy out of these impregnable pillboxes. Imagine, you have 70 pounds on your back, and to be effective you need to get within grenade-throwing range. Your strange backpack is unmistakable on the battlefield, and since the enemy knows exactly what will happen if you get close, all of their weapons will be aimed at you. When your fuel is gone, you still have about 45 pounds on your back. And now you have to make your way back to safety after the entire front line saw and heard your long stream of fire, followed by the screams of the soldiers in the fortification you just destroyed. That was the problem. Flamethrower operators didn't live long, which was proven on Iwo Jima, where their casualty rate was 94%. The first time American forces used flamethrowers on a mass scale against the Japanese was during the battles in the Solomon Islands. There, the vulnerability of the operators was quickly realized, and someone had the idea to combine a flamethrower with a tank to solve the problems of mobility and protection. This led to the creation of the first, not-so-successful flame tanks. These were experimental modifications of the M3 Stuart light tank, equipped with a modified man-portable flamethrower system, which earned the nickname Satan. Their range was about double that of the infantry version, and their continuous fire time was around 40 seconds. However, they were extremely unreliable, failing in combat about 40% of the time. Worse, the Stuart's light armor offered no protection against anything more serious than machine gun fire, and its turret traverse was limited due to the system installed inside. Nevertheless, when they worked and managed to reach the enemy without breaking down or blowing up, their effectiveness against fortifications was undeniable. This was enough to convince the US military to perfect the concept. Just 5 months before the invasion of Iwo Jima, a team was assembled to learn from past failures and create a reliable, battle-ready flame tank. This time, the M4A3 Sherman was chosen as the base. After a complete redesign of the tank, requiring about 1,200 man-hours per unit, 150 pounds of welding rods, over 1,000 electrical connections, and 150 specialized parts, it was finally ready. In place of the main cannon, a flame projector was installed, fed from a tank holding approximately 300 gallons of fuel mixture. It could shoot a stream of fire up to 150 yards for about 80 seconds. However, refueling took about 2 hours, and the mixture itself had to be used within 72 hours of preparation, or it would clog the system. The turret could rotate 270 degrees, and its elevation angles were similar to a standard Sherman. In all other respects, the tank functioned the same, and most importantly, it looked just like any other Sherman from the outside. This last detail would soon become the biggest problem for the Japanese defenders when these new machines landed on their islands. Converting one Sherman into a flame tank cost the equivalent of about $350,000 in today's money. and 8 such machines were ready for the assault on Iwo Jima. The Japanese understood the strategic importance of Iwo Jima and had an entire year to turn it into a fortress. The island's volcanic rock was easy to work by hand, and they dug 11 miles of tunnels, excavated 5,000 caves and underground chambers, and built 1,500 reinforced concrete positions across the 8-square-mile island. About 21,000 men prepared to make a last stand defending their homeland. General Tadamichi Kurabayashi, determined to make the Marines' task as difficult as possible, knew his men would not survive this battle. The orders were clear: no evacuation or resupply once the fighting began. Instead of the hopeless banzai charges seen in previous battles, he developed a detailed plan to make the Americans pay such a high price for the island that they might reconsider invading the Japanese home islands. Every soldier was ordered not to die before he had killed at least 10 Americans. The American fleet slowly approached the island, and for 74 consecutive days, warships and bombers dropped over 6,800 tons of bombs and fired more than 22,000 shells. Allied intelligence naively underestimated the Japanese forces, believing the island was defended by about 4,000 soldiers instead of 21,000. Then they made an even bigger mistake by assuming the island had been completely suppressed by the bombardment and ceased the shelling prematurely. In reality, the Marines approaching the beaches in their landing craft had no idea that only about 200 of the 1,500 Japanese fortifications had been destroyed. The main Japanese forces were still waiting underground in their virtually intact tunnel network, ready to show them a kind of battle they had never seen before. The Marines hit the beaches on February 19, 1945. Although it seemed quiet at first, all hell soon broke loose. By nightfall, the Marines had advanced less than 700 yards at a cost of 2,400 casualties. But the real battle had only just begun. Unbeknownst to the Japanese, among the Shermans that landed on the island were 8 new flame-throwing machines. They were kept in reserve for the first 24 hours, as they were a valuable, irreplaceable asset. The next morning they went into battle. The first was sent to help pinned down Marines near Motoyama Airfield. Flame Sherman 431 advanced to within about 100 yards of a pillbox and opened fire. A Japanese 47mm anti-tank gun fired and hit the Sherman, but the shell ricocheted off. The tank in turn covered the position with a 15-second burst until it was completely engulfed in flames, allowing the Marines to continue their advance. Within 6 hours, all 8 Flame Shermans were in action, burning out one pillbox after another, and striking terror into the Japanese defenders, many of whom began to abandon their positions in a panic as soon as the American tanks got close. And that was just the beginning. As the battle grew fiercer each day, the Marines finally had a weapon capable of destroying the stubborn fortifications that had withstood even the heaviest naval bombardments. The consequences were horrifying. The crews of the flame tanks were often so close to their targets that they could see everything that was happening, and it was a sight no one could ever forget. Marines followed about 50 yards behind the flame tanks, clearing out any survivors. Standard Shermans provided heavy suppressive fire and followed closely to protect the flame tanks as they moved into range. The burning mixture sprayed over Japanese positions, seeped through every entrance and ventilation shaft. If the heat and lack of oxygen weren't enough, remember that the Japanese stored tons of ammunition and fuel in those tunnels. When the flames reached them, countless secondary explosions followed underground, killing everyone inside and burying others alive. Marines often sealed the tunnel entrances with explosives, trapping them underground, still alive. American soldiers could hear muffled grenade explosions and rifle shots from beneath the earth. You can guess what that was. Even elevated positions were not safe. Flame tank crews would drive onto uneven terrain to fire above the normal elevation limit of their projectors, reaching the tops of cliffs where Japanese defenders thought they were safe. There was even an instance of Japanese soldiers under flamethrower attack, jumping from cliffs to avoid being burned alive. Shock and panic swept through the Japanese defenders. Their standard 47mm anti-tank guns could do little against a Sherman's frontal armor. But they found a way to fight back. One as monstrous as the flame tanks themselves. Japanese soldiers began to use desperate tactics. They ran at the American tanks with explosives strapped to their bodies, sacrificing themselves to save others. Although most never reached the tanks due to the close infantry screen, some did. Flame tank number 438 was destroyed on March 11 in exactly this way, when a Japanese soldier detonated himself on the tank's engine compartment, killing 3 crew members. General Kuribayashi reported to his command that the enemy's special flame tanks have inflicted more damage than all their artillery and bombardments combined, and that they had no effective means to counter them. American engineers worked around the clock to keep the flame tanks operational. They were constantly on the front line, either fighting or refueling, with repairs done at night. Fuel was prepared around the clock, and the tanks drove from the front line to refuel and immediately returned to combat, doing this for days on end. The crews were beyond exhausted, but they had to push on. It is estimated that the flame tanks reduced the casualty rate for the Marines by about 40%. By mid-March, organized Japanese resistance had largely collapsed, although ambushes and individual attacks continued for weeks after the island was declared secure. Then came March 21st. After 30 days of heavy combat, the remaining 3,000 Japanese defenders were preparing to make their last stand. The 6 surviving original flame tanks were reinforced with 4 new ones rushed from Hawaii, and they were now ready for the largest flamethrower assault of the Pacific War. Flame and standard Shermans advanced in formation, setting fire to and blowing up everything in their path. Over the course of a single day, they fired 8,000 gallons of fuel mixture. The cost was 92 Marines killed and 257 wounded, which was still far less than the losses a conventional assault would have incurred. They completely broke the last organized Japanese defense. 2 of the original 8 flame Shermans on Iwo Jima were knocked out. The rest suffered various malfunctions from continuous combat and were cannibalized for parts to keep the remaining machines running. The surviving tanks were shipped back to Hawaii, where they were studied, and the design was refined, eventually leading to the next generation of flame tanks, like the M67 Zippo used in Vietnam. Of the 21,000 Japanese soldiers on Iwo Jima, fewer than 200 surrendered and survived. The rest are still on the island, most of them buried in the very tunnels they dug. During the battle, the flamethrowers on Iwo Jima fired approximately 360,000 gallons of fuel mixture. All the U.S. Marines agreed that without those tanks, they would not have captured Iwo Jima, and the already horrific casualties would have been even greater. Seeing this, the Americans went full steam ahead with converting Shermans into flame variants, and prepared about 70 of them for the planned invasion of mainland Japan. They were used again on Okinawa in the final days of World War II, where they consumed over 200,000 gallons of mixture against Japanese defenses.